Welcome in, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into a book that is, well, let's be honest, pretty dark and pretty heavy.
Yeah.
A Father's Story by Lionel Dahmer, the father of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Right.
Now, as true crime fans, most of you know who Jeffrey Dahmer is, but this is not a typical true crime book.
Right.
This is Lionel Dahmer's attempt to understand how his son became a monster.
Exactly. It's fascinating because he's not just recounting events. He's trying to grapple with these huge questions, nature versus nurture, family dynamics, just the crushing weight of a legacy no one would want.
You said it's a legacy no one would choose, and the book is structured chronologically, but it's told from Lionel's perspective.
Right.
So you get his struggles, what he was seeing, what he was thinking, the questions that haunted him. I'm not gonna lie, it's a tough read.
Yeah.
But there's something so raw, so human about it that makes it hard to put down.
Absolutely. It's like he's trying to solve a puzzle that no parent should ever have to face. And in a way, I think that's what makes it so gripping for us as readers, because we're trying to understand alongside him.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
Lionel takes us back to the very beginning, to Jeffrey's childhood, to when his mother Joyce was pregnant with him. And she had a really difficult pregnancy.
Yes.
Intense morning sickness, anxiety. She relied heavily on medication. And reading those descriptions, I couldn't help but think, could this have played a role in Jeffrey's development later on in his life?
That's the question that haunts Lionel throughout the book. He even wonders if the medication she was taking, may have altered Jeffrey's genes during conception or early development. And, back then, the effects of prenatal drugs just weren't as well understood as they are today.
Right. It's easy to look back with hindsight and judge, but back then it was different.
Absolutely.
Still, it makes you wonder about those early influences, how much they shape a child's brain.
Oh, absolutely. And it gets even more complex when you consider Lionel's descriptions of himself and Joyce. He was very analytical, almost detached emotionally, whereas she was prone to these very strong emotional swings. And those fundamental differences in their personalities play a big part in this story.
Yeah, and he even admits that they struggled to communicate effectively, especially when it came to their emotions.
Right.
He was focused on providing materially, not necessarily emotionally.
Yes.
And, thinking about that, it makes me think about the different ways that people experience and express love.
Exactly. And how those differences play out when it comes to parenting. You can imagine how those contrasting approaches to emotions could create a challenging environment for a child to grow up in.
Absolutely. And, he admits that those early struggles as a couple really impacted their marriage.
Right.
And it never fully recovered.
Yes.
So from the very beginning, you have this backdrop of tension, this emotional disconnect in the home.
Right, and that context is so crucial because it really shaped the world that Jeffrey was growing up in. And it really makes you wonder how much those early family dynamics might have influenced his development.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few years. Lionel describes this very vivid memory of Jeffrey as a 4-year-old.
Okay.
And he finds this pile of animal bones under their house.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it turns out some local civets have been stashing their prey there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a little creepy, right?
Yeah, that is, yeah.
But it's interesting because when you think about this seemingly insignificant childhood incident,
Right.
and then you look at it through the lens of Jeffrey Dahmer's later crimes, it takes on this chilling new meaning.
It does. It really does. And it makes you wonder about, the lasting impact of these early fascinations.
Right. Like a harmless curiosity in one kid might be a red flag in another.
Absolutely.
We all had our weird fascinations as kids,
Oh, yeah.
right? But how do you tell the difference between what's normal and what might be a sign of something more disturbing?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what Lionel grapples with throughout the book. He even mentions feeling a sense of dread when he looks back on, Jeffrey's fascination with those bones.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the bones.
Right?
He talks about other incidents too, like Jeffrey asking about cutting on his own belly button.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, or breaking windows in this abandoned building. And looking back on it, Lionel sees these as possible red flags that he didn't recognize at the time.
It's the challenge of hindsight, right? We can't always see the warning signs in the moment, especially when it's your own child. You want to believe the best about them.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, what if someone had intervened earlier?
Well, Lionel did try to intervene in his own way. He describes taking Jeffrey to his chemistry lab,
Okay.
maybe hoping to channel his curiosity towards science.
Yeah.
Like if I can get him interested in something normal,
Yeah.
maybe these darker tendencies will fade.
Right, like a positive outlet.
Right. And it's a really poignant example of how Lionel, despite those difficulties in his marriage and his own emotional reserve,
Right.
was trying to be present in Jeffrey's life,
Right.
guide him in a positive direction.
Absolutely.
But it also brings up those nature versus nurture questions.
Yeah.
Even with the best intentions, can you really change someone's fundamental nature?
Right.
Or is there a point where choices and personal responsibility just take over?
Exactly. And those are the questions that really stay with you.
Yeah.
Were the seeds of Jeffrey's darkness already sown? Or could things have turned out differently with different interventions?
It's impossible to know for sure. But as we start to dig deeper into Jeffrey's childhood, it's clear that Lionel is constantly searching for those answers.
Right, right,
Trying to make sense of how his son could become the monster that the world would come to know.
right. As Jeffrey gets older, that sense of unease in Lionel's account, it just keeps building. He describes Jeffrey withdrawing even further, losing interest in things that most teenagers, enjoy, becoming more and more isolated.
It's like watching the slow-motion train wreck,
Right.
and you can't look away.
Yep.
Lionel describes Jeffrey as being passive and detached. Even his posture, he says, was rigid. His movements were stiff. It's like he was carrying this invisible weight.
It's chilling when you think about what we know now about what was going on inside Jeffrey's mind. Like that outward stillness, it was masking this storm brewing beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And Lionel talks about trying to connect with him, through things like bodybuilding, but it's clear that those efforts were barely scratching the surface.
It's really heartbreaking. You can almost feel Lionel's desperation to connect with his son.
Right.
But he just doesn't have the tools to understand the depth of Jeffrey's struggles. And it makes you think about how tough it is to recognize mental health issues in teenagers, especially if they're not outwardly expressing their emotions.
Absolutely. Adolescence is already such a confusing time, but for someone like Jeffrey, who was struggling internally and not communicating, those warning signs might have been even harder to spot.
Right.
And what makes it even more tragic is that Lionel later found out about some really disturbing things that Jeffrey was doing during this period.
He talks about finding out about animal cruelty, grave robbing. He even created this makeshift cemetery in the woods.
Right.
All this stuff that flew completely under the radar.
It's crucial to understanding Jeffrey's path because it shows that, those warning signs weren't just these subtle hints.
Right.
They were escalating, becoming more and more serious.
Right.
And it makes you wonder how that lack of awareness combined with his isolation created this perfect storm for his darker impulses to take root and grow.
And then things get even more complicated. As Jeffrey tries to navigate adulthood, he tries college, he enlists in the Army. Neither one really works out.
It's a pivotal time for anyone that transition into adulthood trying to find your place in the world.
Right.
But for someone like Jeffrey, who is already dealing with these internal demons, it must have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Lionel describes his first quarter at Ohio State as a complete disaster.
Yeah.
Bad grades, heavy drinking. He even resorted to selling his own blood plasma to buy alcohol.
Wow.
And it's tough to read because you can see this potential in Jeffrey, but you also see this destructive path that he's heading down.
Yeah, it really highlights how tough it can be for young people to find their footing, especially if they're dealing with these mental health issues that haven't been addressed and getting discharged from the Army due to his alcoholism that didn't help either.
No, things spiraled even further after that public intoxication, indecent exposure.
Yeah.
It felt like every attempt Lionel made to steer Jeffrey towards stability just backfired.
Right.
Ultimatums pushing him toward jobs and counseling, it just didn't work.
It really highlights the limitations of those traditional approaches, those attempts to control or fix the situation from the outside.
Right. When the real issues are internal, deeply rooted, it's like trying to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
But then, amidst all this turmoil, a brief period of calm emerges. Jeffrey moves in with Lionel's mother, Catherine, in West Allis, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
He seems to stabilize. He helps around the house, goes to church, even starts seeing someone.
It's like this glimmer of hope, like maybe Jeffrey's turning things around. It makes you wonder if, with the right environment and support system, maybe things could have been different.
And Lionel seems to be clinging to that hope. But Catherine starts noticing some things that trouble her. And instead of talking to Lionel directly, she shares these concerns with Sherry, Lionel's second wife.
It speaks to the challenges that families face when dealing with these difficult issues.
Right.
It's like that desire to protect your loved ones, even when it means turning a blind eye to potential problems. And it highlights the importance of having those outside perspectives, those people who can offer a clearer view of the situation.
So what exactly was Catherine noticing?
Well, one day, she finds a full-sized male mannequin in Jeffrey's closet. fully dressed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, creepy, right?
That's a huge red flag. It's a
Yeah.
clear sign that Jeffrey's inner world is becoming, more and more distorted. His
Right.
thoughts and fantasies are taking a very dark turn.
All right.
And it raises questions about what that mannequin represented to him
Yeah.
and how it might be connected to his, evolving desires.
So Lionel, being Lionel, initially tries to brush it off.
Right.
But Sherry isn't convinced. She sees it for what it is, a sign of something deeply troubling. It's like she has this gut feeling that something is very wrong.
Right.
Something that Lionel, in his desperation for things to be okay, is failing to acknowledge.
It shows the power of those outside perspectives again. Someone coming in with fresh eyes, less emotionally invested, can sometimes see those red flags more clearly. And it makes you wonder how often we dismiss or rationalize away warning signs because we don't want to face that painful truth.
Right. And the mannequin isn't the only disturbing discovery. Later, Catherine finds a gun under Jeffrey's bed.
This ratchets up the tension even more.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know about Jeffrey's history, that discovery is terrifying.
Yeah.
It raises questions about his intentions, about whether, those darker impulses were starting to manifest in a more dangerous way.
And Lionel, again, downplays it.
Mm-hmm.
He accepts Jeffrey's explanation that it's for target practice, but even he has to be feeling uneasy at this point.
Right.
Those cracks in that facade of stability are starting to widen.
It's like this internal struggle, between belief and evidence.
Right.
Lionel wants to believe that his son is okay, but the evidence is mounting that something is very, very wrong.
And then things take another turn when Catherine starts noticing strange odors coming from the basement and the garage. And this is where the story gets really dark.
This is the turning point.
Yeah.
It sets off this chain of events that forces Lionel to confront the horrifying truth about his son's activities.
When Catherine confronts Jeffrey about the smells, he claims that he's doing chemical experiments on animal parts.
Oh my God. Later, he changes his story, saying that it was a dead raccoon that he had found. But the explanations are so bizarre, so clearly out of touch with reality, that it's impossible to ignore the warning signs any longer.
Right. It's clear that Jeffrey's fascination with death and decay,
Yeah.
the manipulation of flesh and bone, has reached this disturbing level. And those experiments are no longer just morbid curiosities.
Right.
They're a glimpse into a mind that's becoming increasingly unhinged.
And Lionel is caught in this awful position. He desperately wants to leave his son, but the evidence is overwhelming. It's like he's battling his own denial, clinging to those fragments of the Jeffrey that he used to know, the boy that he raised.
It's a heartbreaking illustration of the internal conflict that so many families face when dealing with mental illness and disturbing behavior.
Yeah.
That struggle to reconcile the person you love with the darkness that's consuming them. It's this battle between love denial and the terrifying realization that you might not be able to save them from themselves. And as this tension builds, we're left wondering, how long can Lionel hold on to that denial? How long before the truth just comes crashing down and he's forced to face the full, horrifying reality of his son's actions? And that's exactly what happens. Lionel describes getting this phone call, and it just absolutely shatters his world.
Wow.
He calls Jeffrey's apartment, and a police officer answers and tells him that there's a homicide investigation going on.
Oh my goodness.
That's like everything he feared, everything he tried to deny, just comes crashing down on him all at once.
It's just pure shock and disbelief, right?
Yep.
Lionel had always seen Jeffrey as someone who could be manipulated almost like a victim.
Right.
And the idea of him as the perpetrator, the one inflicting harm on others, was just unimaginable.
He talks about clinging to those memories of Jeffrey as a child, trying to reconcile the loving son he knew with this monster the world is now seeing. It's like his mind can't grasp the enormity of what's happened.
It speaks to the power of that parental bond, right? That deep-seated belief in the goodness of your child.
Right.
Even when faced with just horrific evidence to the contrary.
Right.
But it raises questions about how far can that love go? Can it blind you to the truth? Can it become a form of denial?
And as if the weight of the crimes themselves wasn't enough, Lionel and Sherry are suddenly thrust into this media spotlight.
Right.
Reporters are hounding them. Their lives are being dissected and judged, all because of something their son did.
It's a cruel reality for families of perpetrators.
Right.
They become public figures overnight, bearing the burden of their loved one's actions. It's like this added layer of punishment, this public shaming that can be incredibly difficult to escape.
Lionel describes his initial reluctance to engage with the media at all. He refused to do a press conference. He just wanted to hold on to some semblance of privacy.
Mm.
But it's impossible to shut out the noise entirely.
Right. He was a man in shock, completely overwhelmed with shame and the weight of his son's actions. It's understandable that he wanted to retreat,
Yeah.
to protect himself and his family from further scrutiny, but the world just wasn't going to let him off that easily.
And to make matters even worse, one of Jeffrey's victims makes an accusation against Lionel himself,
Oh, wow.
claiming that he was molested by Lionel as a child.
It's a horrifying example of how quickly these accusations can fly in these high-profile cases.
Right.
You know how people search for easy answers or explanations even if they're completely unfounded?
Yeah.
And for Lionel, it's another layer of pain. The feeling of being unjustly accused of having his own character dragged through the mud because of his son's actions.
He talks about attending Jeffrey's trial and the experience of hearing those graphic details, seeing his son through the eyes of the law and the victims.
Wow.
It's like this forced confrontation with the reality of Jeffrey's crimes, a stripping away of any remaining illusions he might have held on to.
It's a crucial turning point in the book, I think,
Yeah.
because it forces Lionel to confront not just his son's actions, but also his own role as a father.
Right, and he starts drawing parallels between himself and Jeffrey, examining their shared traits, like their need for control, their introversion.
Right.
He even recounts this incident from his own childhood, where he hypnotized a friend.
Wow.
And he realizes that his own desire for control, though seemingly harmless at the time, might have foreshadowed Jeffrey's much darker urges.
Right.
So it's like he's trying to understand the roots of Jeffrey's evil, not just in his son's individual psychology, but also in this broader context of family history,
Wow.
inherited traits.
Right.
A really thought-provoking exploration of that nature versus nurture debate.
And he doesn't shy away from examining his own flaws. He delves into his upbringing, his parents' personalities, his own struggles with feelings of powerlessness, and he doesn't try to excuse his son's actions.
Right.
But he's also not afraid to acknowledge the complexity of human behavior, that interplay of genetics, environment, and personal choice.
But even with all that introspection, he's left with more questions than answers.
Right.
And what's really striking is that his story doesn't end with Jeffrey's imprisonment.
Yeah.
He continues to visit him.
Yeah.
They exchange letters. He shares his thoughts on faith and life. It's like he's still trying to connect with that part of his son that he believes is still capable of redemption.
It's a testament to the enduring power of that father-son bond,
Right.
Even in the face of such horrific acts, there's still that love, that desire for connection, a belief in the possibility of change.
Right.
It makes you think about forgiveness, about the limits of empathy, and about the human capacity for both great darkness and great love.
So what do we take away from all of this?
Yeah.
A father's story is a tough read, no doubt. It's a story about monstrous acts and the ripples of pain they create.
Absolutely.
But it's also a story about a father's love, a father's guilt, and a father's desperate search for understanding.
It's a story that challenges us to think about the complexities of mental health, the power of family dynamics, and the limits of our own understanding of human nature. It's a story that leaves us with more questions than answers.
Right.
But that's perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the most important thing is not finding the answers, but simply asking the right questions.
Right. And that's where we leave you today. What resonated with you about Lionel's story? What questions are you left with? We encourage you to keep exploring these themes, to keep asking those tough questions, and to keep seeking a deeper understanding of the human experience in all its darkness and light.